In episode 5 of season 2 of the Blender story course, we're going to go a bit further into UV mapping and learn some more advanced topics. Important things like texel density and straightening UVs to display textures correctly on objects. The model we'll be working on is the same one we modeled together in episode 5 of season 1, the Nightstand. We're going to UV unwrap this object from start to finish, tackle each problem that comes up along the way, and learn something new with every fix. And don't forget, you can download the practice file using the link in the description. Plus, if you're not already part of our Discord community, don't miss out. Join us there to discuss your challenges with others and find solutions together. What could be better than that? Alright, let's jump right in. First things first, let's set up the UV grid texture, which I explained in the previous episode. I'll move my mouse to this corner, click and drag to split the viewport into two sections. I'll click this icon here and change the new section to the shader editor. With the mouse in this area, I'll also press N to close the side panel in the shader editor. Now, I'll select this object, click New, press Shift A and search for Image Texture. I'll select it and drop it here. Then, I'll simply connect the color output to the base color input. At this point, this node isn't loading any image yet. So, I'll click New, select UV grid as the generated type, and give the texture a name. Let's call it UV texture. Then, I'll click New Image. Notice that since we changed the name of the texture, the default node name Image Texture now shows the new name instead. So don't get confused if you see a different name for the node. Finally, to see the texture on the object, I'll move the mouse over here, scroll, and switch the viewport shading to Material Preview. And just like that, we can now see the texture on the object. As you can see, it's pretty obvious here that the texture is stretched, meaning the UV of the object hasn't been unwrapped properly. So let's go ahead and unwrap it. First, I'll click this icon to switch from the shader editor to the UV editor. Now with the object selected, I'll press / on the numpad to go into local view so we can focus on it more easily. Alright, to start, we need to define the scenes, right? So I'll press Tab to enter edit mode and immediately activate UV sync selection here. This will let me see the UVs of the object without having any components selected, and it also ensures that any component I select in the 3D viewport is also selected in the UV editor, or vice versa. Now, the UV unwrap you're seeing here belongs to the box we added at the start of modeling this object. Since we changed the geometry to model this part, we need to adjust the UVs to match the shape of our current object. However, as you can see, we currently don't have access to the components of the object. The reason for this is that we use the bevel modifier during modeling. So, I'll click this icon to go to the modifier properties. Here I need to apply the bevel modifier so we can access the components, right? But if you remember, in season 1, we always emphasized using modifiers as much as possible to model in a non-destructive way. This was so that whenever we changed our minds, we could easily adjust the model without losing progress. But now, at the UV unwrapping stage, you can see that in order to access the components, we have no choice but to apply the modifier. This is making our workflow more destructive. So, what's the solution? Do we just accept it? Say whatever and hope nothing changes in the future? Of course, we can do that, but personally, I'm not brave enough for that. Because what if our mind changes later? What if we were working for a client or director who has different preferences? You know, at any moment, our own opinion or the opinion of the director or client could change, and we always want the option to adjust things. That's why it's a good idea to always keep a backup of the model we've created, so we don't have to remodel the whole object from scratch if we need to make changes later. So, before applying modifiers, or in other words, switching from a non-destructive to a destructive workflow during UV unwrapping and texturing, there are two main solutions we can use. The first solution is to save the scene right here at this stage. Then do a save as and start working on the new save file. This way, you can safely apply the modifiers, and the original model with all the modifiers will stay secure in the previous save file. The second solution is to duplicate all your objects by pressing Shift D, then press M to move them to a new collection and name it something like Backup. You can then click Create. Afterward, by clicking the checkbox, you can disable this collection, and whenever you need, you can activate it again and extract any object you need from it. My suggestion is to use the first method. I think it's a neater way, and also, the file size stays lighter because the geometry is reduced. This really becomes noticeable in more complex models with more geometry. So, I'll right-click on the backup collection, select Delete Hierarchy to remove the collection along with its contents since I already have a save of this scene. Alright, now that we're sure we have an untouched version of the object, we can safely work on it. Alright, before applying the modifier, it's a good idea to ensure that the topology of the object is final and correctly reviewed. I should also have an idea of where I want to place the seams. So to make this easier, I'll press Tab to return to object mode, and I'll turn on wireframe to review the object's topology and make better decisions. For better visibility, I'll press Z and change the viewport shading to solid display so the UV grid texture doesn't distract me. Okay? As you can see, we can consider this edge ring beneath the object as a seam. And it's also a great spot to hide the seam, right? But to unwrap this object better, we need to mark the edges of the corners as seams too, right? However, there are no edges right at the corners. So, in this topology, we either need to consider these edges as seams or these ones. Why not tweak the topology a bit? In the bevel modifier of this object, you can see the bevel segments is an odd number, specifically 5. All we need to do is make it an even number. So we could set it to 4 or 6. For example, I'll change the bevel segments to 4. And now you can see that we have an edge right in the middle of the corner, which is perfect for marking as a seam, right? Now, it's time to apply the modifier. So, I'll click this small arrow and select Apply. Note that if you're in Edit mode, the Apply option will be grayed out. To apply it, make sure you're in Object mode. Okay, now, let's move on to marking the seams. I'll press Tab to go into Edit mode, and as you can see, it's now much easier to access the components. I'm going to press 3 on the top row of the keyboard to activate the Face Select mode. Select this face, press U, and choose Mark Seam. Now I'll press 2 on the top row of the keyboard to activate Edge Select mode. Hold down Alt, and click on this edge. As you can see, the edges are selected. Now, to add to my selection, I'm going to hold down both Shift and Alt, and click on these edges to add them to the selection. Then I'll press U again, and choose Mark Seam. Okay, now I'll press A to select all components, press U again, and this time choose Unwrap and then Angle Based. Now the object is unwrapped and within the UV grid it's packed. Okay, I'll press Z, then activate Material Preview and press Tab to return to Object mode and turn off Wireframe to make it easier to see how the texture is applied to the object. As you can see, at first glance, everything seems fine and there doesn't appear to be any major issues, right? But if you zoom in and look at this area, you'll notice that the texture here is a bit wobbly or zigzaggy, right? These squares should be straight. If you pay attention to the topology of this object, you see that in the center, there is a large square face, and around it, there are a series of long, narrow, and somewhat skinny rectangular faces. If you remember in Season 1, I mentioned that it's better to keep the topology of the object as square as possible with evenly spaced faces, and if they need to get bigger or smaller, it should happen gradually. So for example, I'll press Ctrl R for loop cut, and if I add a loop cut in the middle here by click and then right click, you can see that just adding this one loop cut has already improved the texture issue in this area, and there is no more zigzag texture in this region. If I add another loop cut on both sides, you see that the result gets even better. Okay, now I'll press Ctrl R again, and by scrolling the mouse wheel up, I'll add 3 more loop cuts here as well. Now you can see that by dividing this large face into smaller faces, it's making the mesh more evenly spaced, and the result is looking better and better. Now let me draw your attention to another issue. I'll press Tab to go back to Object mode, then press 1 on the numpad to switch to front view. If you carefully examine the texture on the object, you'll notice that, despite the edges we've added, the texture squares are still not perfectly straight. Instead, they appear to be slanted. This is a very common issue, but it can be easily fixed using a technique called straightening the UV, which I'll introduce to you shortly. On the other hand, the seams we marked at the corners of this object might also reveal the seam of the texture, which is sometimes unavoidable. However, there are ways to hide seams in texturing, which are a bit more advanced, and we'll get into that later. If you look at the original Toy Story 1 animation, you see that they handled the corners of the nightstand in a way that makes it look like the design there is different. They cleverly covered it this way. Now that we've identified the main issues, let's focus on fixing them. The first issue was almost solved by adding the loop cuts, but I'll add 1 more loop cut between each of them so that these faces become even smaller and more evenly spaced. Okay, now I'll press Z and choose Solid Display so we can see the mesh more clearly. If you look under this object, you'll notice that because we had an N-gun face down there, these loop cuts didn't wrap around and meet at the edges, so we need to connect them. I'll press 3 on the top row of the keyboard to activate Face Select mode, then press C to activate Select Circle, and click and drag to select these faces. Then I'll right-click to exit the Circle Select tool, then press I for Inset, and move them slightly inward. Now, all we have to do is select the vertex pairs that are facing each other and press J to connect them. To make this easier, I'll press Ctrl 7 to go to bottom view, activate vertex select mode by pressing 1 on the top row of the keyboard, select this vertex, hold Shift, and click on the other vertex to add it to the selection. Then I'll press J to connect them. I'll repeat this process for every pair of vertices. Now I'll zoom in a bit and connect the 2 vertices in the corner, and I'll do the same for the other 3 corner vertices as well. That's done. Now I'll press Z again, select Material Preview, and use middle click and drag to switch to Perspective View. Now let's move on to straightening the UVs so we can fix the slanted squares in these areas. To solve this issue, I'll go into Edit mode, press A to select all the components, and since we've changed the topology of the mesh, we need to unwrap the UV again so it matches the new topology. This time, I'll move the mouse to the UV editor, press U, and as you can see, when the mouse is in the UV editor and then you press U, the Unwrap menu pops up directly. However, if the mouse is in the 3D viewport, the UV mapping menu opens, and we would have to go to the Unwrap section and select Angle Based from there. So instead, we can move the mouse to the UV editor, press U, and choose Angle Based right here. Okay, after unwrapping, you see that in the UV editor, we now have 3 islands. Apparently, another seam has been automatically added, splitting the UV into 3 pieces. If I switch to Perspective View, you'll notice that when we performed the inset on that bottom face, a seam was created where the inset was made. To remove the seams, first we need to select the edges that were marked as seams. So I'm going to hold Shift and Alt and click to select these edges. And now I'm going to press U again and choose Clear Seam. This removes the red highlight from the edge loop, and we'll need to unwrap the UV once more. So I'll press A to select all components again, move the mouse to the UV editor, press U, and choose Angle Based. Now as you can see, we're left with only these 2 islands. Next, we need to straighten the UV of our object. To do this, we just need to straighten one of the faces in the UV island we want to adjust and make sure that the edges of the face have a 90-degree angle to each other. Let's do it and you'll understand it better. In the UV editor, you can switch between vertex, edge, and face by using the 1, 2, and 3 keys on the top row of the keyboard, which are the same keys we used in the 3D viewport to select components, right? So I'll press 2 to activate Edge Select mode. Let me zoom in a bit here. Okay, now for example, I'm going to select this edge, and to straighten it, I'll press S to scale, then press Y and type 0, then hit Enter. You might not notice a huge change here. Let me zoom in a bit more so it's clearer. You may not see much of a difference, and you might think this edge was already straight. But it's important to do this to make sure that this edge is exactly straight along the horizontal axis. Now I'm going to select this edge, press S, and then press Y to restrict the scaling to the Y-axis. Note that since we are in a 2D space, I'm using the Y-axis, okay? Now I'm going to type 0 and hit Enter. Alright, you see that this edge is now straightened. If I undo and redo, you can spot the difference, although it's very subtle. Okay, let me zoom in a little more. Now I'm going to select this edge, press S, then press X, type 0 and hit Enter. I'm going to repeat the same for the other edge as well, or I could use Shift R to repeat the last action. Alright, now you can see that the face has been straightened in both axes. The next step is to make sure that all the faces in this island follow this face's alignment. It's really simple. First we need to select the face. So I'm going to press 3 to activate Face Select mode, and then click to select this face. Then I'll make sure my mouse is over this island, and now I'll press L to select linked faces. Notice that only this island is selected and the other island is deselected. You can also see that this face has a lighter color, indicating that it's the active face. Now I'm going to press U and choose Follow Active Quad from the menu. I'll leave the edge length mode set to its default length average and click OK. And yep, as you can see, it failed me. It turns out that when I was using undo and redo to show you the difference, the edges of the face weren't perfectly straight. So even if the edges are only slightly tilted and not perfectly straight, we won't get the correct result. You can see that the island hasn't been straightened properly. Alright, I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo, and let me zoom in and give it another shot. I promise I won't let you down this time. Now, I'll do this again for this face. One by one, I'll select these 4 edges and straighten them with a scale. Alright, now I'll press 3 to activate Face Select mode, select this face, and let me zoom out a bit. Now I'll press L then U, and choose Follow Active Quad. I'll click OK, and yes, as I promised, I won't disappoint you. Okay, as you can see, the UV island is now straightened properly, and if I undo and redo, you can easily spot the difference from before. Now, if I switch to front view by pressing 1 on the numpad and take a look at the texture in the viewport, you'll notice how much smoother it's displaying compared to before, right? This is the magic of straightening the UV island. Now, I'll press Tab to go back to object mode, switch to perspective, and that's a wrap on the UV for this object. So, let's hit / to exit local view, and now I'm going to select this object, press / again to enter local view for it, and let's dive into the next challenge, UV unwrapping the Nightstand body. As you can see, for this object, we used two types of bevel modifiers, and it's time to apply them. But before we apply, I'm going to press 7 on the numpad to go into top view, and then I'm going to press Ctrl W, which I've manually assigned for wireframe to toggle it on. This will let me see the object's topology clearly. Now, I'm zooming in on this corner of the object. Alright, here we are, once again in a similar situation we faced with the previous object. This means that it's better to have an edge right here in the middle, so we can mark it as a seam. It also means I should change the bevel segments to an even number. So I'm going to open up the bevel modifier and change the segments to 4. But here's the thing. This time, I'm not doing it just for the seam. The reason I'm choosing an even number is that when I go to fix this big n-gun face, having an even number of segments will allow me to create this part with better topology and ease. So where should I place the seam? Good question. First, let's apply the bevel modifiers. Now I'll middle click and drag to switch back to perspective view. And since the back of the object typically aligns with the wall, it's best to place the seam here on one of these vertical edges, right? So this time, instead of choosing this edge for the seam, I'm going to mark this vertical edge. That's why even if the camera shows the object from the side, the seam won't be visible. Cool, right? So I select it, press U, and choose Mark Seam. Alright. Let's move on to evening out the mesh faces. I'll press Ctrl R, click once, and then right click to add a loop cut in the middle of each side of this object. Very good. Now it's time to join these vertices together, just like we did with the previous object. So I'll press 7 to go to top view, zoom in a bit, then press 1 to activate vertex select mode. I select this one, hold Shift, select the other one, and press J. Now I'll select both of these, and press J again to connect them. It's that simple. Pair by pair, I'm joining the vertices that are right across from each other. Here's a cool little tip. When I want to select a vertex, I don't have to aim the cursor directly on the vertex itself. I can just hover near it and then click, and it selects the vertex. Pretty neat, right? Blender is way smarter than we give it credit for. Okay, now I'll connect these corner vertices the same way. And there we go. Now I'll middle click and drag to return to perspective view, and if you look under the object, you notice that the bottom face needs to be done the same way, right? So I'll press Ctrl 7 to go to bottom view, zoom in a bit, and you guessed it, I'll connect these vertices just like before. Now I'll middle click and drag back to perspective view, hold Alt, and click on this edge. Then I'll hold Shift and Alt, and click on these edges to select this edge loop. Now I'll rotate in the viewport, select this edge loop, press U, and choose Mark Seam. Next, I'm gonna press A to select all, U again, and select Unwrap followed by Angle Based. Now, I haven't assigned the UV grid material, so I'll go to Material Properties, click here, and select the UV grid material for it. As you can see, the top and bottom faces look fine, but to fix this weird slanted texture, we just need to straighten out the UV. So, in the UV editor, I'm gonna select this edge, press S, Y, type 0 and hit enter. After that, I'm going to select this, press Shift R. I'm going to select this one, press S, X, and type 0 and press enter. Then I'm going to select this one and press Shift R again. Now I'm going to activate face select mode by pressing 3. Select this face, press L, then U, and choose Follow Active Quads. And here I'll click OK. And immediately, you see that the UV is straightened out, and the texture on the object is displayed correctly. But down here, the texture is a little distorted. No worries though, I'll press Ctrl 1 to add a subdivision surface modifier with level 1, and just like that the problem's gone. As the mesh faces becomes more refined with the smaller squares, the distortion is smoothed out. And there you have it. This object is all set. Now, I'll hit forward slash to exit local view, and this time, I'm going to select the Nightstand's leg object and hit forward slash to enter local view again. As you can see, this object also has two bevel modifiers and a mirror modifier. So first, I'm going to open up the first bevel modifier and change the segments to 6, which is an even number. By now, you know why, right? It feels great that we are on the same page. Alright, now, instead of clicking on the tiny arrow to select apply from the menu, I'll bring the cursor over the bevel modifier and press Ctrl A to apply it. I'll do the same for the second one. Just move the cursor over the modifier and press Ctrl A. Okay? You don't need to apply the mirror modifier, and don't worry about the texture repeating. If you'd like, I can show you how texture repeats were handled in Toy Story 1 to put your mind at ease. Now, for this object, we don't need to fix the topology on the top and bottom faces because the top face will be hidden under the Nightstand's body and the bottom face will be on the ground, so they won't be visible. The only face that will be visible are these side faces. So let's move on. I'll press Tab to go to Edit Mode, press Ctrl R, and add a single loop cut right in the center. Okay, next, let's focus on marking the seams. I'm going to press 3 on the top row of the keyboard to activate Face Select mode, select the top and bottom faces, then press U and choose Mark Seam. Now, let me rotate a bit in the viewport and zoom in on this section. Alright, I'm going to hold Alt and click on this edge, then press U and select Mark Seam again. Does that make sense? Since this inner edge is less likely to be in view, it's a great candidate for the seam. Now I'm going to press A to select all, bring the cursor to the UV editor, press U, and select Angle Base to finish up the unwrapping. Alright, I'm going to zoom in a bit on the UV editor, and as you can see, this island needs to be straightened. So I'm going to select this edge, press S, then Y, type 0, and press Enter. Next, I'm going to select this edge and press Shift R to repeat. Now I'm going to select this edge, press S, then X, and type 0 and press Enter. And I'm going to also use Shift R again here. Now, I'm going to select this face, press L, then U, and choose Follow Active Quads, and hit OK. That's done. Next, let's assign the UV grid material and see the result. Okay, as you can see, if I zoom in a little here, there is an issue with this part. But no worries, I'm going to simply add a subdivision surface modifier with level 1 by pressing Ctrl 1. I think it would be better with level 2. Yep. Now we can see that the issue is fixed and the texture is applied properly. The only problem left is at the top and bottom faces, where the texture is stretched because of the subdivision surface modifier. However, since these faces won't be visible, we don't need to spend more time on them. But if you'd like, to make sure you've fully grasped these concepts, you can fix the endgun faces on the top and bottom of this object. Okay, this object is done. I'm gonna press / to exit local view, and next, let's move on to the drawers. I'm gonna select the top drawer, enter local view by pressing /, change the bevel modifier's segments to 4, and apply it using Ctrl A. I'm going to turn off the subdivision surface modifier for now, then press Tab to go into edit mode, and start selecting edges. I'm going to hold Alt and Shift together to select these edges like so. Super easy. Now, let's go to the other side, and select the edges over there. Okay, I'm going to press U, choose Mark Seam, press A to select everything, press U again, and select Unwrap followed by Angle Based. Done. Next, I'm going to go to the Material Properties, assign the material, and there we go. Okay, now I'm going to go back to straighten this face using the same method I showed you earlier. So, first I'm going to select the edges and scale them 1 by 1 to straighten them. Then, I'm going to select this face, press L, then U, choose Follow Active Quads, and click OK. I'll use the exact same method for this island and straighten it out as well. I'll straighten the edges along the appropriate axis with a scale, then select the face, press L, and after that I'm going to press U, choose Follow Active Quads, press OK, and there we go. Now I'll go to the Modifier Properties, enable the Subdivision Surface Modifier, and that's it for this. Now I'll exit local view by pressing /, and this bottom object is going to get the same UV unwrap as the previous one. So no need to show you again and waste time in the video. I just unwrapped it the way I showed you earlier, straightened the islands and assigned the material. Now let's move on to the handle objects. I'm going to select it and enter local view, then press Tab to go into edit mode, I'll simply select these edges, press U, and choose Mark Seam. After that, I'm going to press A and unwrap it. Now, I'll assign the material to it. Alright? You'll notice here that the UV island needs to be rotated so the texture appears correctly on the object. So, I'll move my cursor over the island, and notice that if I'm in vertex select mode or edge select mode, pressing L will select all the components shared between the two UV islands. Here, I just need to switch to face select mode by pressing 3 on the top row of the keyboard, and this way, after pressing L, only the island that the cursor is on will be selected. Once the island is selected, I'm going to press R for rotation and rotate it until the texture lines up correctly on the object. I'll do the same with this other island, select it with L and rotate it. Okay, that's it for the handle. For the bottom handle object, just repeat these steps, or you can use Alt-D to make a linked duplicate, then select both objects, press Shift-S, and choose Selection to Active to place it exactly at the position of the last selected object. Then, just click here once more, press G to move it, and simply delete it. Now, there's just this cylindrical object behind the handle left. So, I'm going to select it, go into Local View, then hit Tab to enter Edit mode, select the cap faces, press X and delete them. I'm going to select this edge, press U and Mark Seam, then press A and unwrap it. And now I'm going to assign the material to it. Okay, I'll return to Object mode and exit Local View by pressing /. Now, I'm going to use Alt-D to make a linked duplicate. I'll first select this one, and then that one, press Shift-S, and choose Selection to Active. Finally, I'm going to select the previous object, move it out, and delete it. And that's it. The UV unwrap is done for all the objects of this nightstand. Now, if you take a look at the object, you see that the UV grid texture has been applied correctly to all parts of our model. The image is straight and smooth, and there is no distortion. But there is one super important detail here. If you pay attention, you'll notice that the size of the UV grid texture on different objects in this 3D model isn't the same. On some objects, the squares of this texture are larger, and on others, they are smaller. And this is where texel density comes into play, and understanding it becomes necessary. Don't worry, we're not going to go too deep into technical stuff here. We're just going to cover the basics of texel density and keep it really simple. The detailed explanation can wait for later, much later. So, simply put, when you see this kind of thing, different texture sizes on different parts of the object, it means that the texel density of the UVs is not the same. This means the texel density for this object should be uniform so that we don't run into problems with the texture resolution we want to apply to the object. The texture should have a consistent resolution across all parts of the object. For example, if we apply our material with the current texel density, this is how it will look. But if the texel density were like this, the material would show up differently on the object. So, to put it simply, we need to adjust the UV dimensions of this object so that the UV grid texture, which we're using as a guide, appears at the same size all over the object. That's it. Simple, right? Now that we've got a basic understanding of texel density, let's see how we can make the texel density consistent across different parts of this model. It's really simple. First, we select all the objects, then press Tab to go into Edit mode. In the UV editor, you can see that all the UV islands from the different objects are now overlapping. Now, I make sure my mouse is over the UV editor, press A to select all the islands, and then it's really easy. Just go to the UV menu and select Average Islands Scale. By doing this, Blender scales all the selected islands in a way that makes their texel density uniform based on the object's scales relative to each other in the scene. Now, if I press Tab to go back to Object mode, you can see that the UV grid texture has the same scale on all the objects, right? But if you zoom in a bit, you'll notice that the texture scale on these two drawer handle objects is much smaller, right? The same thing goes for the legs of the nightstand. Can you guess why? Well, the issue comes down to the scale of these objects. If you look at the object properties, you see that the scale of these objects is not set to 1. And if you remember, I've always emphasized throughout this course that the scale of the objects should always be set to 1. So, to fix it, since these two are linked duplicates, I select both of them, press Ctrl A, and choose a scale to apply their scale and set it to 1. Now, I select these two objects again, press Ctrl A, and apply their scale. Similarly, I select the legs and apply their scale too. Now you'll see that their scale has been changed to 1. Okay? Now we need to select average islands scale for them again. So I'm going to select all the objects, press Tab to go into edit mode, make sure my mouse is over the UV editor, press A to select all the islands, and from the UV menu, I choose average islands scale again. Now you see that the texture scale is the same across all parts. Everything looks great. Now there's just one last step, and that's packing these islands into the UV grid. You haven't forgotten about packing, right? Okay, for this, we first make sure all the objects are selected, press Tab to go into edit mode, then in the UV editor, press A to select all the islands, and then from the UV menu, we select Pack Islands. Here, we make sure the rotate option is turned off and click Pack. And as you can see, all the UV islands are packed into the UV grid. Perfect. Now, I press Tab to go back to object mode, and everything is ready for material creation. The only thing left here is that if you rotate in the viewport and look at the back of the main body of the nightstand, you see that around the area where we marked the seam, the texture gets distorted. This usually happens when you apply the subdivision surface modifier to an object. To fix this, simply open the advanced section in the subdivision surface modifier, and in the UV smooth options, there are various settings for how the UV reacts when the mesh is smoothed. In this case, you just need to choose Keep Corners from the list, and that will fix the texture stretching around the seam and make it look better. So that's taken care of. Just a heads up guys, there is still more to explore when it comes to texel density and packing islands. There are other things you'll need to know, but for now, don't worry about them. Gradually, you'll get familiar with these things. For now, we're just focusing on getting the work done and enjoying the process. For the material creation of this object, we're not going to use pre-made textures. Instead, we'll be using the procedural method to create the material. If you haven't heard of it, no worries. It's a very powerful and useful technique, but since creating procedural materials requires a lot of focus, make sure you've practiced and mastered the UV work we did in this part, and then in the next episode, we'll go ahead and create the plastic material with a weave-in pattern. Thank you so much for following along with the video so far, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye everyone.